And with that, I'll turn it over to our introducer, Day Mount, a member of the Falmouth Forum Committee. Thank you, Day.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thanks also to Tucker Clark, who developed this forum, but unfortunately can't be here tonight. I know she's watching. Thank you, Tucker. John Langford is a native of Georgia. He's now a resident of Falls Church, Virginia, but he has a Falmouth connection. He grew up spending part of each summer in West Falmouth on land bought by his great-great-grandfather, Jacob Sloan Fassett, in the early 20th century. And those of us who are familiar with West Falmouth know Little Island and Little Island Road and that area of West Falmouth. And that's where he has a home and is fortunate. We're fortunate that he's here with us tonight. Apparently that's where John first became fascinated with rockets when he was a young man in the 1960s and the United States entered the space program. And that interest eventually took him to MIT, where his studies broadened out into aerospace and aviation. Indeed, he holds 4 degrees from MIT, a bachelor and master's in aeronautics and astronautics, a PhD in aeronautics and public policy, and an MA in defense policy. He has many, many accomplishments on his record. He's a past president of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Aviation Week lists him as a Lifetime Achievement Laureate. Other honors, they're all earned for what he has actually done. He founded Aurora Flight Sciences in 1989 to design and manufacture high-altitude unmanned aerial vehicles that could be used for global climate change research. And that very successful organization was sold to Boeing in 2017. He founded a firm called Athena to develop flight control solutions. That was also very successful and was subsequently sold to Rockwell Collins. He founded Estes Industries to make model rockets and rocket engines. And apparently his family, 2 sons and a daughter, are currently involved in that enterprise. And he founded Electra-Aero, a firm to develop sustainable urban and regional flight vehicles that could land on a rooftop, on a parking place, on a soccer field. We're going to learn some more about that, I believe, tonight. In sum, John embodies the American spirit that we think of an inventor or tinkerer who works to create things that challenge the conventional wisdom, things that we just accept without dealing with them. And also in doing so, tries to serve the public good. Please welcome John Langford.
Well, thank you, Day, and thank you, Penny and Tucker, for setting this up. It's really a pleasure to be here and to learn more about the forum. I think I've been in the auditorium a number of times, but mostly as part of like the Woods Hole Film Festival and things like that. So, what I wanted to do tonight is just share some thoughts on electric aircraft, which are in the news a lot because this idea of sort of Jetsons-like flying air taxis has caught on, at least in certain segments of the investment community and the popular press. And I wanted to kind of share some thoughts and experiences and backgrounds about where that might actually lead and where it might not. As Day mentioned, my background is a unifying focus of what I'm interested in these days is STEM education, about how you reach the next generation and inspire them to careers in engineering and science. And the model rockets played a big role in my upbringing, and as Day mentioned, our family had a chance to be a part of keeping that 70-year-old business going for precisely because it's such a STEM education tool. a lot of human-powered airplanes, 30 years or so in the unmanned aircraft space, and now working in the sustainable aviation space, electric aircraft and the like. What I wanted to do tonight is just split the comments into sort of three broad categories. First, to tell a local story, a professor from MIT, but who spent much of his life in Centerville, very close to here, and some of you may have heard of him. His name was Otto Koppen, and I'll talk about that story. I want to then get into why electric propulsion doesn't make as much sense in aviation as it does in cars than terrestrial applications, and then talk about an application where it might actually make sense that I'm involved in with a number of colleagues here. So part of that, just sort of reference, I'll talk a lot about a word called ESTOL, which stands for alternately either extreme or electric, is what the E is interchangeably used for, but short takeoff and landing. And if you just think of normal airplanes, the commercial aircraft that fly out of Logan, those are called conventional takeoff and landing, and they use runways. They need between 3,000 and 7,000 or more feet of runway, so a pretty big space. Short takeoff and landing, you'll hear that used. Some of the things like Cape Air flies kind of fall into that category. They need between 1,000 and 3,000 feet of runway to take off and land. Then you have your vertical takeoff and landing stuff that helicopters are the most obvious part, but lots of other permutations on that. And those can take off in like one body length of the vehicle. So, 50 to 100 feet of space. And, that's the kind of stuff you fly out of the Falmouth Hospital here on the med flights back up to Boston. What we're doing is in the ESTOL business is the extreme short takeoff and landing. So it's almost as short as a helicopter and significantly shorter than anything else that is out there. So 50 to 500 feet, which is an order of magnitude shorter space requirement than anything else. So we like to say that in that field, we're using wings, but not necessarily using runways in that. And that's sort of a key concept here. So the Koppen story. Otto Koppen was born in 1900 in New York. He was part of the development of American aviation. He went to MIT. He worked for the Ford Motor Company when they were building airplanes in the 1920s. He spent most of his career on the MIT faculty, where he became one of the world's leading experts in stability and control. But what I've really come to appreciate, I heard his name when I was a student there. He had retired in the 60s and relocated down here to the Cape. But he was a passionate advocate of these very short takeoff and landing aircraft, and teamed with a guy from Harvard University, a professor at the business school. In the 1940s, they started a company called Helio Aircraft to try to build airplanes that could take off and land in really short spaces. This is a picture of one of their airplanes, of their prototype, flying off the athletic field at MIT. And they developed that into a fairly successful business that had a lot of different versions, a lot of different instantiations of this short takeoff and landing airplane, most of which went to various parts of the military, actually. They ended up getting used a lot in Vietnam. The intelligence agencies used them a lot. And the other big user of this has been missionary organizations. People who want to fly into remote areas, land in small spaces, and deliver missionaries, people, and supplies. So those have been the two big users of these airplanes. So about 1,000 of these were built, and they were far from the only short takeoff and landing. These are just some of the samples. There have always been some of these. All the great powers in World War II had versions of them. primarily for taking people in and getting them out of denied areas. In the 60s, they were building them as possible, urban area to urban area transports. NASA did a bunch of research in the 60s and 70s. The Air Force experimented with cargo transports. And there's a competition every year that you may have seen on TV in, I think, Alaska, where they do the extreme, really extreme, like they can get off the ground in like, I think 9 feet is the record, okay? And while those are not practical airplanes, they do illustrate what the technology can do being pushed. That upper right figure here is Coppin's airplane taking off from a tennis court at Harvard University. Now, few of you have probably ever seen one of these airplanes because they did not make it in the popular, they did not become mainstream tools. Those aircraft proved that the concepts worked, but the airplane itself was a lot of work to fly, physically very demanding, had a lot of flaps and control surfaces, and took a lot of the pilot to fly it. Taking off turns out to be really easy in a short space, but landing is really tough because there's only a short space to land in. You have to hit the landing target very precisely. And again, with the tools in the 50s and 60s, that was a real challenge. Then, in the 1950s, there was no real infrastructure for what we now would call an on-demand transportation system. Uber revolutionized things, and Uber was possible mostly because of the advent of networked mobile devices, right? The cell phones that could talk to big networks, and you could call a ride from anywhere to anywhere on demand. And that is a really powerful concept, obviously in ground transportation. It's not yet here in air transportation, but it is coming. And that is, the infrastructure, the electronic infrastructure for that didn't exist in the 50s and 60s, but it does exist today. And the other is the infrastructure of what we sort of call pocket airports, pocket STOL ports, which it's interesting that Coppin and Bollinger, actually, there are records of them, the newspaper accounts that I've read. I'd love to see the actual minutes, but they went into the Cambridge City Council and they were petitioning for permission to set up these multiple airports inside the city of Cambridge, which, if you are familiar with Cambridge, is kind of a boggling idea. And they were actually doing demonstration flights from like Polaroid facility on Route 128 down to Logan Airport and stuff like that. But it never got to the critical mass to where it became a commercial success writ large. But it did prove out a lot of the interesting ideas. I'm going to set that aside for just a second and now talk about electric airplanes, which is, I'll show you how these connect in a minute, but sort of the challenges of electric airplane flight. And for that, you kind of step back, and there's, 2 big themes, I think, in aviation today. One is crowding and congestion, right? Which was a lot of what has made the experience of flying. The good news is it's made it affordable. The bad news is it's made it pretty miserable because from the time you walk into the airport to the time you get out, you're in very crowded spaces. And obviously in the COVID era, that's brought with it a whole nother set of issues. Second is broadly called Fliegskam, right? The flight shaming movement, writ large, the need for sustainability, the need to decarbonize the whole economy. And aviation, although it's a relatively small contributor today, 3-ish% of the global carbon emissions come from airplanes, it's a growing segment, and it's an important segment. And interestingly, it's one of the hardest parts of the economy to decarbonize because, as you'll see in a second, hydrocarbon-based fuels are just really great for airplanes. So, we live in a world where electric cars are really proliferating. They've entered that stage of very rapid growth. They've moved from this sort of fringe idea that, while there's always been an electric car concept out there somewhere, and some of the, more than 100 years ago, 120 years ago, there were early model electric cars. The internal combustion engine kind of won that first round, and so all modern cars have been internal combustion. But you're seeing electric really come on in a strong way. There's still a small fraction of the total fleet, and the rate of production and dissemination is going to have to increase dramatically to get to the kind of decarbonization levels that we need to see by 2050. But it is happening there. It really is happening. So why not airplanes, right? That would seem to be the next step. Consumers, right, are interested. They don't really care what's in it as long as it's safe, it's convenient, it's fast, it's clean, it's quiet, and it's affordable. And the affordability is a really big piece of the equation. And when you look at stuff, first blush, batteries look pretty good. These are sort of four major ways that airplanes could get driven around. I guess any vehicle could, but the turboprop, the turbofan, battery powered, and fuel cell powered. And they start with some amount of energy on the vehicle. In this case, turboprops and turbofans, you start with kerosene, right? And then they burn it in an engine. And then they run it through maybe a gearbox and then through either a propeller or a set of fans. And what comes out turns into useful work, useful thrust on the airplane is a pretty small fraction of what you started with, like 30 to 40%. So you're getting like a third of the energy that you started with on board is actually useful. The rest of it is primarily rejected as heat. Batteries look really good. They can get over 70% because the batteries are efficient, the electric motors have gotten really good, and propellers can be quite good. So you go, wow, well, that looks pretty impressive. And the fuel cell is sort of in between. It's not the panacea you might think because the fuel cells themselves are only in the 50 to 60% efficiency range, and then they're electric from then on. So they kind of fall in between what we know of today as airplane engines and what you think you could do with batteries. The problem turns out to be the battery weight, because weight is sort of everything in airplanes. This is a chart that on the x-axis shows what's called specific energy. It's how much energy, and in here it's measured in watt hours, per unit of weight, per unit of mass, watt hours per kilogram. And the vertical axis is sort of how much space it takes up. That's called the volumetric efficiency, or the specific energy of volumetrically. And that's like, how compact is this? And you can kind of see a bunch of, down on the left, lower left, are a bunch of batteries, also things like flywheels or pumping up air, all kinds of ways to store energy on a vehicle, down in the lower left. Up on the top is kerosene, and over on the right is hydrogen. And you can see hydrogen is really good on the specific energy. It's got a lot of energy for a very little mass. The problem is how you store it, right? And if it's just gaseous down here at the bottom, it has a very low specific volume, and then you can pump it up, which makes it smaller but even more dangerous, or you can liquefy it, which is great, except it's got to be really cold, and then you got to insulate it. And everything else kind of falls in between there. The best, you on this chart, you want to be up and to the right, and it's interesting to see, milk and dynamite and other things are sort of plotted on that chart. But the basic point is that batteries, historically, that's a log chart, are like 2 orders of magnitude worse than hydrocarbon fuels, okay? And on a car, that doesn't matter all that much, because once you got batteries good enough to drive a couple of 100 miles, right? The limit that a human can, the sort of bladder limit, how long can people sit in a closed environment without being able to get up, walk around, and use a lavatory, which is a real limit in transportation devices. Once you get to that couple 100 miles, the batteries are good enough. That's not true in aviation, as we'll see in just a second. Just to put it into context, one of the things that we did as students at MIT was build a human-powered airplane that was allowed to have supplemental energy storage. The rules of this particular competition gave you 10 minutes before you took off, in which the pilot could store their energy any way they wanted. So they could wind up a rubber band, charge up batteries, spin up a flywheel, whatever. And our team at MIT actually developed a hybrid electric system where they charged up batteries. And the point of this is that blue circle is the energy, is where a human being falls on that chart. So the pilot was also the engine of this airplane. And where he fell on that chart is that big blue circle. So you can see only slightly better than batteries of the day. That sort of makes the point that humans are pretty lousy airplane engines. They're good pilots, but poor engines. But the batteries are in that same kind of ballpark. They're a lot closer to the human than they are to kerosene. And so nobody would seriously talk about human-powered airplanes as a practical transportation device. And so you have to start to be a little careful when you start to talk about batteries as practical airplane devices. Here's another way of looking at it. This is the history. The x-axis now is time, the whole history of aviation since the Wright brothers to today. And up top is that energy density of fuel-based airplanes. But in this case, we've started with the fuel, but we've also burned it through the engine. So we've taken those knockdowns that you saw earlier. And you can see that it's grown about 1% a year in efficiency over the last 100 years is what we've been able to see. Piston engines, turboprops, turbofans, and you throw a line through that whole history. It's gotten better about 1% a year. Down at the bottom is the batteries. And again, this is a log chart, right? So each of those is a factor of 10 in terms of goodness, of energy density. And batteries have grown about 2% a year for much of that time. And then recently, we've seen with the development of the lithium-ion cells in the 90s by Sony and now others, a jump that, it's a little hard to fit the data through there, but you could see something like 4% or 5% a year, although I think more likely what you see is a rapid early growth and then the technology sort of asymptotes. A lot of time is spent speculating how good could batteries be, and they definitely are getting better, but the point of this is they still have a really, really long way to go before they compete with airplane fuel. And therefore, the chance of seeing a 737 or bigger class airplane fly electrically in the lifetime of anybody in this room is pretty low. I will also say, let me go back to that, in addition to one of the big things about airplanes is they're highly regulated. The reason they're safe is that they are highly regulated in this country, primarily by the FAA. And so this is the best aviation-rated battery on the market today. It's about 80 watt-hours per kilogram, and you can see it's significantly lower than what should be possible, but I'll talk about that in a second. By the time you get it packaged and rated and safe to fly in a vehicle that carries humans, you've given up a significant chunk of the potential that those batteries started with. This is the chart of where a lot of that goes, right? You start with a cell that I just said here 100%, and then some of that is you have to package it. The packaging has to be crash proof. You have to be able to have one of these things catch fire in flight and not hurt the airplane. And then the batteries get worse as they age. If you think of your cell phone, right? You replace your cell phone every couple of years because the battery really begins to die after hundreds of cycles. It's not thousands of cycles, which is okay for your cell phone maybe, but on an airplane, it's going to be very expensive to replace that quantity of batteries. And then when you actually go fly the airplanes, there you have to have reserves, right? Airplanes never land, or almost never land, completely out of fuel. They have very strict reserve criteria depending on the type of airplane and the type of mission it's flying. And a typical airplane may land with half the energy that it took off with still on board, less on the really long-haul airplanes. But you know, the 737s that you fly from Boston to Orlando, that airplane probably lands with half the energy still on board that it took off with. So when you actually factor all this in, you're going to have somewhere between a quarter and a half of the energy of your great cell that actually makes it into the airplane. And so what that does is it turns into it makes it a tough cell on the battery. This is to make an electric airplane. You will see people who take airplanes and make them electric, but what they don't really tell you is how bad they got as a result in terms of performance. This is a Twin Otter. It's a commuter class airplane. I don't think Cape Air flies any Twin Otters, but there's a lot of them around. And this is what's called a payload range curve. It shows how much payload, how many people, versus how far. And that black line is what the airplane can normally do, right? If you make it electric, and this is a chart that says how much you make it electric, how much is coming out of fuel and how much is coming out of batteries, you get a series of curves until this is the pure battery. So a battery-powered version of this airplane would have the performance in green, and a fuel-powered version would have the performance shown in black. And that is a substantial decrease in the performance of the airplane and thus in the economics. And it goes through, you know, it's very scenario specific, right, about comparing different ideas and technologies. But this is the system where you put everything in together. This turns out to be really important for hydrogen. People like to talk about hydrogen, which has two big problems. One is most hydrogen today, essentially all hydrogen today, is not green. It's made by a reforming process that produces a lot of CO2. And the second is that you got to store it on the airplane, and then you got to count the weight of whatever you're storing it is, along with the weight of the fuel. And that's what makes hydrogen look pretty bad in a lot of these trade studies. Not as bad as batteries, but still significantly below all the different options for the existing fuels. This is another way of looking at it. This is basically a chart of range versus how much payload you can carry on the airplane, and overlaid on this are a series of contour lines of the energy density of the fuel. So if you could store, that's 100, this is 100 watt hours per kilogram. So that's 10, 100, 1,000. And you know, pure jet fuel comes out here, it starts at like 12,000. And so you can see a bunch of the existing airplanes are all plotted on here, and they have, you know, long ranges, and you can see the longer the range, the lower their fraction of payload. That makes sense. The more, the longer the range, the higher the percentage of fuel on board. And then you kind of go back and look at this is the commercial drones that you've probably seen flying around, the little quad rotors. They're way down here in terms of what they can do. And there's only one currently certified electric airplane that you can buy, and it's in the light sport category. It's made in Slovenia, and it's that yellow circle called the Pipistrel Alpha. And fortunately, they make that airplane in two versions, a battery version and a fuel version. And the fuel version is the red triangle, and the battery version is the yellow square. And otherwise, they're exactly the same airplane. And so you can see, again, how these things translate from theory into practice, and essentially what the penalty that's being paid for electrifying the airplane is. And it shows up in, it's complicated, but payload and range, endurance. One useful way to look at it is how much useful work that airplane can do. And again, this is about a factor of 6 between the electric version and the conventional fuel version of the same airplane. So why would anybody do this, right? Why would you do electric? And there's 3 reasons that I can think of and see in this. One is that the market may require you to do this, right? Market unlocks, where you may be regulated to where you can only have 0 emission airplanes. The second is that there are niche markets where it might make sense. Trainers, for example, where you don't really care about the performance. All you're going to do is take off and land all day and just fly around the pattern, and you can recharge between a bunch of short flights. Or these high altitude, long endurance airplanes that stay up for months. And maybe these urban air mobility things. And then the final thing is this performance through integration, where what the electrification does, the electric motors does, is they allow you new freedom as a designer to sort of decouple the whole idea of the way airplanes are done today, where airplane companies build the airframe, engine companies build the engine, and they stick them together. So you have this tube and wing kind of concept, and actually integrate the electric motors into the airplane in ways where the aerodynamics and the propulsion begin to interact in ways they never did before. And that is the third part of this. That's what we're doing. That's where we think this short takeoff and landing and electric propulsion may be a combination that really makes a lot of sense. And so that's kind of part 3 of what I wanted to talk about. This thing started back at MIT as a, I mentioned Professor Koppen, but the modern equivalent are 2 professors, John Hansman and Mark Drela, who about 5 years ago said, hey, what if we took these distributed electric, this idea of having lots of small electric motors, but instead of trying to use them as a helicopter thing, we used them to what's called blow the wing, to make the wing have a very high lift capability. Would that be a good idea? And they did a bunch of studies, and it turns out that it actually is a really good idea. These are some of this to illustrate some of the blown lift airplanes that have been done in the past. None of which were Koppen's airplane was a traditional airplane. They had flaps and slats and stuff, but there was no interaction between the motor, the engine, and the wing. And that gets you data down in here, right? This is the angle of attack, the angle that the air hits the wing down here, and you have different flap settings that you can set. And higher on this curve is good, right? So here's a basic airplane, and you put the flaps down, and it can get a higher lift coefficient. Well, by combining the propulsion and the wing aerodynamics together, you can move these black curves up to these blue curves, and you can get numbers that are like 5 to 10 times more lift off the wing than you can get off of a normal airplane. And that takes this idea of super short takeoff and landing and really amplifies it. What these high lift coefficients allow you to fly slowly. The flying slowly allows you to land in really short spaces. And that's really the idea of what we're focused on, is being able to land in almost the same amount of space helicopters can operate on. So you could, not the space of one helipad, but often there are multiple helipads right next to each other. So you can operate off of the target design point we have is the helicopter port in Manhattan, the Wall Street heliport, which there are 3 operational heliports today in Manhattan, and each of them has space to accommodate multiple helicopters and enough space that if you could fit one of these super short, extreme short takeoff and landing airplanes into something about the size of a soccer field, you could take off and land normal winged airplanes in the place today you can only land helicopters. And if you can do that, you can operate all kinds of places, including at parts of large airports where you don't have to wait in line to use the big runways. You can get in and out of these vertiports that people are proposing. You can get in and out of roads and soccer fields and the tops of parking garages and stuff like that. I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk that there's a lot of interest in this field. This is a sampling of like 20 of the probably 100 ideas that are out there of people who are trying to use electric propulsion and do these urban air mobility, they're called, the sort of Jetsons flying car idea. And Uber, it was really popularized by Uber a couple of years ago in a program called Uber Elevate. And the idea was Uber was going to put out an airborne equivalent of their ground service. And so a lot of people are pursuing that. A lot of money has been poured into that. And the progress is, we'll see how that comes out. Our analysis is that you can always beat the vertical design with one of these short takeoff and landing designs, as long as you can afford a little bit of real estate. If you can get 300 feet of space, you can beat these things in very substantial margins. This is comparing 3 basic concepts that are used in these different ideas, and trying to normalize them all to one weight of an airplane and going for a 6,000-pound airplane, how much payload could I carry if it's battery and if it's hybrid on these 3 different designs? And you can see that the short takeoff and landing gives you, on the order of 2.5 times the performance that the vertical designs are going to give. That's just basically driving through the physics. And that advantage gets better the bigger you make the airplane. So it scales up nicely. These are 3 different conceptual designs, but they're tied to real designs that are out there. And you can sort of see that, these things, in this case, being low is good. This is the weight of the whole airplane to carry a given payload size. So 500 pounds is like 2 people, and 2,000 pounds, you get up to like 9 people. And this is how much the airplane would have to weigh to carry that much payload for, in this case, 300 miles. And this curve is a little different depending on the exact scenarios you pick, but the trends are very similar. And that's the basis for our idea that this short takeoff and landing is economically much better than the vertical takeoff and landing designs. And so that's kind of the basis of what we're doing today with this company called Electra that we started with the idea to be a part of the decarbonizing of aviation, and starting by developing these urban and regional mobility solutions that can operate everywhere from Manhattan, the Wall Street heliport, to really unimproved fields in remote areas. And we do that by a hybrid propulsion system. And think of it's very much like in the Prius, where you have a battery and you have a fueled engine. And the battery, and in our case, it's a turbo generator. So it's it's actually a small jet engine, but instead of making thrust, it drives an electric generator. And those 2 together feed a power bus that drives a bunch of electric propulsors. And those, in our case, those electric motors are lined along the front of the wing, and they provide this blown lift. That ends up getting incorporated in an airplane that can seat about 9 people, and with an average stage length of like about 200 miles, although it can fly much further than that if you take to take some of the payload out. But for these missions, the 200-mile range seems like a good compromise point. The fact that it's hybrid shows up in a couple of different ways. This is just a plot of where the energy is coming from. You have the turbo generator and you have the battery. And the turbo generator basically is turned on at the beginning and essentially runs at a flat operating point for the whole flight, maybe for the whole day. And then all of the throttle settings, the moving of the throttle, the extra power for takeoff and landing and stuff like that, that all comes out of the battery. And that has a bunch of improvements in maintenance costs, basically. But one of the big ones you can see is the yellow line is the state of charge of the battery versus the time in the flight. The gold is the e-stol, and the black line is the vertical takeoff and landing. So the VTOL designs, you're going to exhaust the whole battery on every flight. And this hybrid design, you can land with the battery fully charged, which means you can land at places that don't have big power charging stations, which is going to be a big issue for many, many users who want to go places where there's not a network of charging stations installed. The market for this, if you believe the marketing, the companies that do study these things for a living, the consulting companies, is very large. They have numbers that start with trillions over 10 and 20 years and numbers that talk like 80,000 airplanes and stuff. That's part of the reason that a lot of venture money has flowed into this area. Those are very large numbers compared to anything that's ever been done in aviation. Remember the story of Otto Koppen? They built 1,000 of those over 30 years. And essentially, it's the closest anybody has ever done to what this is trying to do. But big dreams, a lot of people interested in it. And we've started, about last summer, started showing this short takeoff and landing design, and it's gotten a really good market response, not just in the urban air mobility and the regional air mobility, but also in how you move cargo from distribution points. Like if you think of cargo distribution, like Walmart has like 4,000 distribution centers, not stores, distribution centers, most of which are not on airports and therefore are served only by truck or rail. But with an airplane like this, you could land in a section of the parking lot, you could land in a section of the roof, and you could provide a private cargo distribution network sort of on demand to all of the different retail organizations that need it. Say nothing of emergency response. You'd be able to fly these things off the docks here in Woods Hole, for example. There's been a lot of interest from the U.S. government in this. The U.S. government has a great program that promotes small business innovation, and there's been a lot of military interest, not only in getting in and out of areas that are hard to get to and that you don't want people to know you're going in and out of, but also for this idea of expeditionary power, that one of the things, the first thing a unit of soldiers worries about is ammunition, but the second thing they worry about these days is batteries and electrical power. And that is a 5-kilowatt generator underneath a CH-47 helicopter. And this airplane, the plane we're developing, would be a 400-kilowatt flying generator that could self-deploy. So that has actually gotten a lot of interest from defense. And for missions like this is how you would fly out of Poland and land at the presidential palace in Kyiv, of where there is parking garage, a soccer field, all the kinds of places that you would need to get in and out of. And you could do that the whole idea of this is very, very quietly. Helicopters arrive, but everybody, if you go in a helicopter, everybody knows that you just landed in a helicopter, and that is why they're not really publicly acceptable in populated areas, and why militarily they're not very useful, because if you want to do a mission that secretly or quietly, the helicopters have real challenges. So we're in the process of building models and doing propulsion test beds. We have the whole system running on the ground, and we're building a 2-seat demonstrator and a prototype with the idea of actually having a product in like 2027, and that's what we think the product looks like. This is why we think it's a great idea. These are this is this payload range thing of how much it can carry versus how far. These are the eVTOL designs down here in this corner. That's a Bell 429, sort of a standard helicopter standard Cessna Caravan, and what we think we can do with the hybrid electric blown lift design, which we think has, and we can do this at operating economics that beat the Caravan. And helicopters have about 5 to 7 times higher per hour costs than fixed wing airplanes. So the operating flexibility of a helicopter with the costs competitive with the fixed wing is really what we're focused on. And so this is the last chart, and we'll open it up to questions. But I just think it's kind of a fun story that shows how there's, most of these ideas are not new in and of themselves. This is an idea that was tried 70 years ago by people at MIT and Harvard. And the question is whether the evolution of technology has moved far enough to now make it a viable transportation mode, right? What's changed? The blown lift, the distributed electric propulsion, the hybrid electric, the computers and controls and satellite navigation that allow you to land precisely where you're trying to land, and this idea of networked mobile devices so you can have this all be an on-demand service. It's part of what makes this an exciting time in aviation. As I mentioned, there are well over 100 concepts going after this market. There's probably 20 or 30 companies, probably 10 of them fairly well funded, and nobody knows who's going to be the winner in this, whether any of them are going to work, whether all of them are going to work. And work means technically, but also it means as a business model, which is really what it takes to become a product or a service. And that's part of what makes it a really exciting time in aviation. And when people talk about this need to decarbonize being a stimulus for innovation, it really is. And this is a great example. It's down at a small end of the market. There's not lots of carbon being emitted by this part of the market, but the innovation, the ideas that are going to be proven out in these small vehicles is what will then grow out into the larger vehicles, and it's how over the next couple of decades we'll make real progress in decarbonizing aviation in a real way. So that is that's what I had, and I would be happy to take questions in the remaining time here if we have some. Yeah.
You're in the audience in the auditorium here and you have a question, please just wait for the microphone, raise your hand, we'll come to you.
That was terrific. Thank you. Very interesting. What is the competitive response that you're receiving from the traditional airline, aircraft manufacturers and so forth? You get, behemoths out there that maybe they're ignoring this market for the time being, but you have Textrons out there where you're going after their market with Caravans and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd be curious in terms of what you see as the competitive challenges and responses.
No, that's a great question. So Textron just bought that aviation company, that electric aviation company I mentioned in Slovenia. So that's how Textron is putting their foot into the market. I think everybody realizes electric is super important to the future, but everybody realizes it has a long way to go to, to move into prime time, and nobody's quite sure of how this will end out. The big companies tend to be very risk averse, right? That their approach is primarily to let the startup culture do the innovation and de-risk an idea and let all the ideas that are going to fail on somebody else's money, and then they will buy the innovation that has been proven to work. I mean, that's kind of how American industry works today. The big corporate R&D labs are by and large gone, and it's primarily a venture-funded universe with capital coming in from a lot of areas. A lot of companies get started, a lot of companies fail. Those that don't fail, a few of them grow into big companies on their own. I mean, you look at all of the big ones. I mean, Apple, Microsoft, Google, all of those are startups from, people in my generation. They didn't exist when I was in elementary school. The big aviation companies all kind of, their big heyday, they all got started in the 20s and 30s. There was a William Boeing, there was a Jack Northrop, and they built these companies largely driven, the modern companies really came out of World War II. I think the big guys are watching carefully. They all have dabbled in this, I would say. Part of why Boeing bought Aurora was exactly to experiment in this area. Part of why Airbus did a program called A-Cubed. They've each tried a couple of things in that. And I think they're waiting to see how it all works out. They certainly believe something will happen. It's just nobody's sure what yet.
Very nice. Lithium is I guess, the highest energy density technology at the moment for batteries. Is there anything on the horizon that will do better in terms of energy density and weight for the aircraft propulsion or any other application?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had always made the assumption that in the airplane business, we didn't really have to worry about batteries because the car people would develop them for us. And that's changed a lot, mostly through a paper I was fortunate to be involved in that was a combination of battery engineers, battery scientists, and airplane people. And I'll refer you to it's a paper that came out in Nature on January 26th. And the answer is, yeah, there's a couple of different promising technologies that still involve lithium, but different cathodes in there that could make some pretty decent breakthroughs, because aviation is less cost sensitive than the automotive, right? The automotive focus is how you scale up and make decent batteries in large quantities. It's all about cost for the automotive side. Aviation is more willing to pay for the performance, and when you're more willing to pay for performance, there's more options, and a lot of them haven't really been explored yet. So I think, yes, there are some things that are in the lab that you could see some real improvements. Now, what is a real improvement? Maybe a doubling. You could get to 600 to 800 watt hours per kilogram. That'll still be far below what conventional fuels are, but it starts to make regional airliners not completely crazy as rechargeable. I mean, I don't think that any of the batteries that are covered in this paper really are good enough to make a 737 electric, which is why, and it takes you know, if it's in the lab today, it's a decade away from being in real service. But the short answer is yes, but it still will it'll get you to maybe twice as good as you are today, which is really, really good. It opens up a lot of things, but it doesn't change the basic conclusion that it's really hard for batteries to buy their way into big aviation
I think we have a
by
couple.
themselves. There has to be something more than just the battery part. Yeah.
I think we have a couple online.
Yes, the first question is a two-parter. How can you approach the safety of fixed wing, especially major jet aircraft? And what is the expected glide ratio of your hybrid electric plane?
What was the second part of the question again?
What is the expected glide ratio
Glide
of your
ratio.
hybrid
Glide.
electric plane?
Got it. Yeah, thanks. So I'll answer the second part first and then the first part. So one of the interesting things about an airplane like this is its aerodynamic performance is no longer just a function of its geometry. On most airplanes, the glide ratio, or what we really care about, is the stalling point, the lift coefficient at which the wing stalls, normally is a function of the angle and what those flaps are set at. But now in this airplane, it's also a function of the throttle, because the throttle is no longer just the forward propulsion, it also controls the aerodynamics of the wing. And so that's one of the things we've been working with the FAA right from the very beginning on. How do you certify an airplane whose aerodynamic performance depends on the propulsion setting? The answer is, on the specific answer to the glide ratio question is, it can be really good. This technology can be used either for very efficient cruise or for really short takeoff and landing. The efficient cruise designs have better glide ratios than the extreme short takeoff and landing. But, you know, in this size of airplane, 18 to 20 is the kind of thing we're looking at. Can you approach the safety of a big airplane? That is a really great question. One of the challenges that aviation has is it has been so successful in making the large commercial transports safe that the bar is really, really high on this. You know, if you look at the data, the safety of a light airplane, of a helicopter, of a corporate aircraft, they vary quite a bit, and none of them are as good as the big commercial carriers. The big commercial carriers do that in a bunch of ways, like a lot of equipment, a lot of training, a lot of procedures, is basically what the focus on that is. And you know, the light airplanes have a number of reasons why they're less safe, but one clearly is that you have to have professionally trained crews. Now, a lot of us think that the way that gets better in the future is increasing automation in the airplane. And so some of these designs go all the way to let's make them fully autonomous and let's let the airplane fly itself. That was what, in the unmanned aircraft space, that's really what we were doing for 30 years. Getting it to where it is certifiable is really hard, because how you certify computer systems that can handle indeterminate situations is tough. It's easy to do a lot of automation, and like in this airplane, the landing approaches will be very, very heavily automated, but there's still a person at the controls supervising the whole process. You know, the industry has to figure out how to do this with safety standards that are commensurate to what people already see in big commercial aviation, or the public won't stand for it. I mean, you look at this, the MAX was a huge tragedy, right? But 2 airplanes crashed and a couple of hundred people were killed. Over 1 million people have died in this country in the last 2 years, right, from COVID. And people, not everybody, this group obviously is well masked, but a lot of people in this country just shrug that off, right, and go, I'm tired of this, and I want it to be over, therefore it's over. There's how society values life and what the value that's placed on and what we're willing to spend to prevent an accidental death varies enormously with the activity that you're talking about. And aviation is among the highest bars there are out there. And people take risks every day. Aviation is safe because the industry works super hard and spends a lot of money doing it. And I have every expectation that that's what we're going to do in this area. But one of the concerns is you will see with a lot of new entrants, we are definitely worried about accidents in the early stages that would turn some of the public fascination and media enthrallment to the opposite side of taking a skeptical to even negative approach on some of this.
We're out of time. I think we'd all have some more questions, but please thank our speaker one more time.
Sure.